Vào luôn nhỉ. Trời muốn mưa. Đây chứ. Bây giờ mình sẽ xem tiếp nhé. Bây giờ là lúc 3 giờ chiều ngày mùng 10 tháng 8 2024. Sáng mình có live 1 tiếng rồi, xem Lex Fridman rồi. Thì chiều mình xem tiếp. Rồi, trên màn hình đây. Sáng mình xem đến 5 tiếng mấy nhỉ. Nghe tiếng giống mưa. Mình nhớ xem hết cái này đây, đúng rồi.
And now, dear friends, here's Bliss Chapman, Brain Interface Software Lead at Neuralink. You told me that you've met hundreds of people with spinal cord injuries or with ALS, and that your motivation for helping at Neuralink or Neuralink.
Lead Brain Interface
Chapman, Brain Interface Software Lead
at
Neuralink. You told me that you've met hundreds of people with spinal cord injuries or with ALS, and that your motivation for helping at Neuralink is grounded in wanting to help them. Can you describe this motivation?
Yeah. First, just a thank you to all the people I've gotten a chance to speak with for sharing their stories with me. I don't think there's any world really in which I can share their stories as powerful a way as they can.
Trẻ thế nhỉ? Bliss Chapman Bliss Chapman Neuralink link hả? Brain Interface Software Lead. Cái gì vậy? 2016 đến 2019 học đại học. Má. Application Developer Software Engineer Apple 2017. 2016 đến 2019 mà 2017 đã đi làm Apple rồi intern. Mưa không vậy? Course Assistant University in Neuralink từ 2018 đến 2019. Machine Learning Engineer ở Apple từ 2019 đến 2021. Brain Interface Software Lead luôn. Từ đây nhảy đến đây ghê vậy. Brain Interface Software Brain Lead rồi, ghê vai. Thế là 2016 là kém mình 7 tuổi à? Sinh năm 2018 à? Sinh năm 1998 à?
But just I think to summarize at a very high level, what I hear over and over again is that people with ALS or severe spinal cord injury in a place where they basically can't move physically anymore, really at the end of the day are looking for independence. And that can mean different things for different people. For some folks, it can mean the ability just to be able to communicate again independently without needing to wear something on their face, without needing a caretaker to be able to put something in their mouth. For some folks, it can mean independence to be able to work again, to be able to navigate a computer digitally efficiently enough to be able to get a job, to be able to support themselves, to be able to move out and ultimately be able to support themselves after their family maybe isn't there anymore to take care of them. And for some folks, it's as simple as just being able to respond to their kid in time before they, run away or get interested in something else. And these are deeply personal and sort of very human problems. And what strikes me again and again when talking with these folks is that this is actually an engineering problem. This is a problem that with the right resources, with the right team, we can make a lot of progress on. And at the end of the day, I think that's a deeply inspiring message and something that makes me excited to get up every day.
So it's both an engineering problem in terms of a BCI, for example, that can give them capabilities where they can interact with the world. But also on the other side, it's an engineering problem for the rest of the world to make it more accessible for people living with quadriplegia.
Yeah, and I think I'll take a broad view sort of lens on this for a second. I think I'm very in favor of anyone working in this problem space. So beyond BCI, I'm happy and excited and willing to support in any way I can folks working on eye tracking systems, working on, speech to text systems, working on head trackers or mouse sticks or quad sticks. And I've met many engineers and folks in the community that do exactly those things. And I think for the people we're trying to help, it doesn't matter what the complexity of the solution is as long as the problem is solved. And I want to emphasize that there can be many solutions out there that can help with these problems. And BCI is one of a collection of such solutions. So BCI in particular, I think, offers several advantages here. And I think the folks that recognize this immediately are usually the people who have spinal cord injury or some form of paralysis. Usually you don't have to explain to them why this might be something that could be helpful. It's usually pretty self-evident. But for the rest of us, folks that don't live with severe spinal cord injury or who don't know somebody with ALS, it's not often obvious why you would want a brain implant to be able to connect and navigate a computer. And it's surprisingly nuanced to the degree that I've learned a huge amount just working with Nolan in the first Neuralink clinical trial and understanding from him in his words why this device is impactful for him. And it's a nuanced topic. It can be the case that even if he can achieve the same thing, for example, with a mouse stick when navigating a computer, he doesn't have access to that mouse stick every single minute of the day. He only has access when someone is available to put it in front of him. And so a BCI can really offer a level of independence and autonomy that if it wasn't literally physically part of your body, it would be hard to achieve in any other way.
So there's a lot of fascinating aspects to what it takes to get Nolan to be able to control a cursor on the screen with his mind. You texted me something that I just love. You said, I was part of the team that interviewed and selected P1. I was in the operating room during the first human surgery, monitoring live signals coming out of the brain. I work with the user basically every day to develop new UX paradigms, decoding strategies, and I was part of the team that figured out how to recover useful BCI to new world record levels when the signal quality degraded. We'll talk about, I think, every aspect of that, but just zooming out, what was it like to be a part of that, part of that team, and part of that historic first?
Yeah, I think for me, this is something I've been excited about for close to 10 years now. And so to be able to be even just some small part of making it a reality is extremely exciting. A couple maybe special moments during that whole process that I'll never really truly forget. One of them is during the actual surgery. At that point in time, I know Nolan quite well. I know his family. And so I think the initial reaction when Nolan is rolled into the operating room is just a, oh shit, kind of reaction. But at that point, muscle memory kicks in and you sort of go into, you let your body just do all the talking. And I have the lucky job in that particular procedure to just be in charge of monitoring the implant. So my job is to sit there to look at the signals coming off the implant, to look at the live brain data streaming off the device as threads are being inserted into the brain, and just to basically observe and make sure that nothing is going wrong or that there's no red flags or fault conditions that we need to go and investigate or pause the surgery to debug. And because I had that sort of spectator view of the surgery, I had a slightly removed perspective than I think most folks in the room. I got to sit there and think to myself, wow, that brain is moving a lot. When you look into the little craniectomy that we stick the threads in, one thing that most people don't realize is the brain moves. Mm-hmm. The brain moves a lot when you breathe, when your heart beats, and you can see it visibly. So, that's something that I think was a surprise to me and very, very exciting to be able to see someone's brain who you physically know and have talked with at length actually pulsing and moving inside their skull.
And they used that brain to talk to you previously, yes. And now it's right there moving.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't realize that in terms of the thread sending. So the Neuralink implant is active during surgery. So, and one thread at a time, you're able to start seeing the signal.
Yeah.
So that's part of the way you test that the thing is working.
Yeah. So actually, in the operating room, right after we sort of finished all the thread insertions, I started collecting what's called broadband data. So broadband is basically the most raw form of signal you can collect from a Neuralink electrode. It's essentially a measurement of the local field potential, or the voltage essentially measured by that electrode. And we have a certain mode in our application that allows us to visualize where detected spikes are. So it visualizes sort of where in the broadband signal, in this very, very raw form of the data, a neuron is actually spiking. And so one of these moments that I'll never forget as part of this whole clinical trial is seeing live in the operating room, while he's still under anesthesia, beautiful spikes being shown in the application, just streaming live to a device I'm holding in my hand.
So this is no signal processing, the raw data, and then the signals processing on top of it. You're seeing the spikes detected.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a UX too. Because
Yes.
that looks beautiful as well.
During that procedure, there was actually a lot of cameramen in the room, so they also were curious and wanted to see. There's several neurosurgeons in the room who are all just excited to see robots taking their job. And they're all, crowded around a small little iPhone watching this live brain data stream out of his brain.
What was that like, seeing the robot do some of the surgery? So the computer vision aspect where it detects all the spots that avoid the blood vessels, and then obviously with human supervision, then actually doing the really high precision connection of the threads to the brain.
Yeah, it's a good question. My answer is going to be pretty lame here, but it was boring.
Yeah.
I've seen it so many times. Yeah, that's exactly how you want surgery to be. You want it to be boring.
Yeah.
Because I've seen it so many times. I've seen the robot do this surgery literally hundreds of times. And so it was just one more time.
Yeah, all the practice surgeries and the proxies. And this is just another day.
Yeah.
So what about when Nolan woke up? Well, do you remember a moment where he was able to move the cursor, not move the cursor, but get signal from the brain such that it was able to show that there's a connection?
Yeah. Yeah, so we are quite excited to move as quickly as we can, and Nolan was really, really excited to get started. He wanted to get started actually the day of surgery, but we waited till the next morning, very patiently. It's a long night. And the next morning in the ICU, where he was recovering, he wanted to get started and actually start to understand what kind of signal we can measure from his brain. And maybe for folks who are not familiar with the Neuralink system, we implant the Neuralink system, or the Neuralink implant, in the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is responsible for representing things like motor intent. So if you imagine closing and opening your hand, that kind of signal representation would be present in the motor cortex. If you imagine moving your arm back and forth or wiggling a pinky, this sort of signal can be present in the motor cortex. So one of the ways we start to sort of map out what kind of signal do we actually have access to in any particular individual's brain is through this task called body mapping. And body mapping is where you essentially present a visual to the user and you say, hey, imagine doing this. And that visual is, a 3D hand opening and closing, or index finger modulating up and down. And you ask the user to imagine that. And obviously you can't see them do this because they're paralyzed. So you can't see them actually move their arm. But while they do this task, you can record neural activity. And you can basically offline model and check, can I predict or can I detect the modulation corresponding with those different actions? And so we did that task and we realized, hey, there's actually some modulation associated with some of his hand motion, which was the first indication that, okay, we can potentially use that modulation to do useful things in the world. For example, control a computer cursor. And he started playing with it, the first time we showed him it. And we actually just took the same live view of his brain activity and put it in front of him. And we said, hey.
Mình không biết có phải sự trùng hợp không, nhưng mà bạn này là bạn trẻ nhất trong mấy người mà mình xem đến giờ, đúng không? Không phải chính xác là trẻ nhất trong những người mà trong cái clip này, và nói nhanh nhất luôn. Thì đó là cái mà mình đang cố gắng luyện tập. Thứ nhất là mình quan sát là những người càng lớn tuổi thì càng nói chậm, và mình muốn được nói chậm bởi vì là mình thấy nói nhanh nó không hiệu quả, và nói chậm thì nó cảm giác nó được tạo được cái cảm giác là cái chất lượng hoặc là cái kiến thức của người đấy nó uy tín hơn. Thì mặc dù đây là người rất là giỏi, nhưng mà có thể là sự trùng hợp đi, là nói nhanh nhất trong những người từ nãy giờ trong cái clip này.
Hey, you tell us what's going on. We're not you. You're able to imagine different things, and we know that it's modulating some of these neurons. So you figure out for us what that is actually representing. And so he played with it for a bit. He was like, I don't quite get it yet. He played for a bit longer, and he said, oh, when I move this finger, I see this particular neuron start to fire more. And I said, okay, prove it. Do it again. And so he said, okay, 3, 2, 1, boom. And the minute he moved, you can see like instantaneously this neuron is firing. Single neuron, I can tell you the exact channel number if you're interested. It's stuck in my brain now forever. But that single channel firing was a beautiful indication that it was behaviorally modulated neural activity that could then be used for downstream tasks like decoding a computer cursor.
And when you say single channel, is that associated with a single electrode?
Yeah, so channel and electrode are interchangeable.
And there's 1,024 of those.
1,024, yeah.
It's incredible that works. That really, when I was learning about all this and like loading it in, it was just blowing my mind that the intention, you can visualize yourself moving the finger, that can turn into a signal. And the fact that you can then skip that step and visualize the cursor moving or have the intention of the cursor moving, and that leading to a signal that can then be used to move the cursor. There's so many exciting things there to learn about the brain, about the way the brain works. The very fact of their existing signal that can be used is really powerful.
Yep.
But it feels like that's just like the beginning of figuring out how that signal can be used really, really effectively. I should also just, there's so many fascinating details here, but you mentioned the body mapping step. At least in the version I saw that Nolan was showing off, there's like a super nice interface, like a graphical interface.
Yeah.
Like, it just felt like I was like in the future because it like, you know, I guess it visualizes you moving the hand.
Yep.
And there's a very like a sexy polished interface that hello.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a voice component, but it just felt like it's in, like when you wake up in a really nice video game and this is a tutorial at the beginning of that video game.
Yeah.
This is what you're supposed to do. It's cool.
No, I mean, the future should feel like the future.
But it's not easy to pull that off. I mean, it needs to be simple, but not too simple.
Yeah, and I think the UX design component here is underrated for BCI development in general. There's a whole interaction effect between the ways in which you visualize an instruction to the user and the kinds of signal you can get back. And that quality of sort of your behavioral alignment to the neural signal is a function of how good you are at expressing to the user what you want them to do. And so, yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about the UX, of how we build our applications, of how the decoder actually functions, the control surfaces it provides to the user. All these little details matter a lot.
So maybe it'd be nice to get into a little bit more detail of what the signal looks like and what the decoding looks like.
Yeah.
So there's a N1 implant that has, like we mentioned, 1,024 electrodes, and that's
Mình thấy hạt mưa.
collecting raw data.
Mình thấy hạt mưa hay sao ấy. Đúng rồi, để cất quần áo đã. Quần áo đang phơi ở ngoài.
Signal. What does that signal look like? And what are the different steps along the way before it's transmitted? And what is transmitted? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. This is going to be a fun one.
Let's go.
So maybe before diving into what we do, it's worth understanding what we're trying to measure, because that dictates a lot of the requirements for the system that we build. And what we're trying to measure is really individual neurons producing action potentials. And action potential is, you can think of it like a little electrical impulse that you can detect if you're close enough. And by being close enough, I mean like within, let's say, 100 microns of that cell. And 100 microns is a very, very tiny distance. And so the number of neurons that you're going to pick up with any given electrode is just a small radius around that electrode. Mm-hmm. And the other thing worth understanding about the underlying biology here is that when neurons produce an action potential, the width of that action potential is about 1 millisecond. So from the start of the neurons produce an action
when neuron produce an action potential,
the width of that
the width of action potential about 1 millisecond. Okay.
action potential is about 1 millisecond. So from the start of the spike to the end of the spike, that whole width of that sort of characteristic feature of a neuron firing is 1 millisecond wide. And if you want to detect that an individual spike is occurring or not, you need to sample that signal or sample the local field potential nearby that neuron much more frequently than once a millisecond. You need to sample many, many times per millisecond to be able to detect that this is actually the characteristic waveform of a neuron producing an action potential. And so we sample across all 1,024 electrodes about 20,000 times a second. 20,000 times a second means for every given 1 millisecond window, we have about 20 samples that tell us what that exact shape of that action potential looks like. Example that comes from your neuron firing is 1 millisecond wide. And if you want to detect that an individual spike is occurring or not, you need to sample that signal or
Sample the signal.
sample the local field potential
Sample the local full potential nearby
nearby
neuron
that neuron much more frequently than one.
more frequently than 1 millisecond. Không hiểu.
A millisecond. You need to sample
Many times per millisecond.
many, many times per millisecond to be able to detect that
Detect
this
this
is actually
actually
characteristic waveform of a neuron producing an action potential. And so we sample across all 1,024 electrodes about 20,000 times a second. 20,000 times a second means for every given 1 millisecond window, we have about 20 samples that tell us what that exact shape of that action potential looks like. And once we've sort of sampled at super high rate the underlying electrical field nearby these cells, we can process that signal into just where do we detect a spike or where do we not? Sort of a binary signal 1 or 0. Do we detect a spike in this 1 millisecond or not? And we do that because the actual information carrying sort of subspace of neural activity is just when are spikes occurring. Essentially, everything that we care about for decoding can be captured or represented in the frequency characteristics of spike trains, meaning how often are spikes firing in any given window of time. And so that allows us to do sort of a crazy amount of compression from this very rich, high density signal to something that's much, much more sparse and compressible that can be sent out over a wireless radio, like a Bluetooth communication, for example.
Quick tangents here. You mentioned electrode.
quick tension là gì?
Quick tangents here. You mentioned electrode neuron.
Neuron.
There's a local neighborhood of neurons nearby.
Yep.
How difficult is it to isolate from where the spike came from?
Yeah, so there's a whole field of sort of academic neuroscience work on exactly this problem of basically given a single electrode or given a set of electrodes measuring a set of neurons, how can you sort of spike sort which spikes are coming from what neuron?
Hiểu.
And this is a problem that's pursued in academic work because you care about it for understanding what's going on in the underlying sort of neuroscience of the brain. If you care about understanding how the brain's representing information, how that's evolving through time, then that's a very, very important question to understand. For sort of the engineering side of things, at least at the current scale, if the number of neurons per electrode is relatively small, you can get away with basically ignoring that problem completely. You can think of it like sort of a random projection of neurons to electrodes. And there may be, in some cases, more than one neuron per electrode. But if that number is small enough, those signals can be thought of as sort of a union of the two. And for many applications, that's a totally reasonable trade-off to make and can simplify the problem a lot. And as you sort of scale out channel count, the relevance of distinguishing individual neurons becomes less important because you have more overall signal and you can start to rely on sort of correlations or covariance structure in the data to help understand when that channel is firing, what does that actually represent? Because you know that when that channel is firing in concert with these other 50 channels, that means move left. But when that same channel is firing with concert with these other 10 channels, that means move right.
Okay, so you have to do this kind of spike detection on board. And you have to do that super efficiently, so fast and not use too much power because you don't want to be generating too much heat. So it have to be a super simple signal processing step.
Yep.
Is there some wisdom you can share about what it takes to overcome that challenge?
Yeah. So we've tried many different versions of basically turning this raw signal into sort of a feature that you might want to send off the device. And I'll say that I don't think we're at the final step of this process. This is a long journey. We have something that works clearly today, but there can be many approaches that we find in the future that are much better than what we do right now. So some versions of what we do right now, and there's a lot of academic heritage to these ideas, so I don't want to claim that these are original Neuralink ideas or anything like that. But one of these ideas is basically to build a sort of like a convolutional filter almost, if you will, that slides across the signal and looks for a certain template to be matched. And that template consists of sort of how deep the spike modulates, how much it recovers, and what the duration and window of time is that the whole process takes. And if you can see in the signal that that template is matched within certain bounds, then you can say, okay, that's a spike. One reason that approach is super convenient is that you can actually implement that extremely efficiently in hardware, which means that you can run it in low power across 1,024 channels all at once. Another approach that we've recently started exploring, and this can be combined with the spike detection approach, is something called spike band power. And the benefits of that approach are that you may be able to pick up some signal from neurons that are maybe too far away to be detected as a spike, because the farther away you are from an electrode, the weaker that actual spike waveform will look like on that electrode. So you might be able to pick up, population level activity of things that are, maybe slightly outside the normal recording radius, what neuroscientists sometimes refer to as the hash of activity, the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
And you can look at sort of across many channels how that sort of background noise is behaving, and you might be able to get more juice out of the signal that way. But it comes at a cost. That signal is now a floating point representation, which means it's more expensive to send out over power. It means you have to find different ways to compress it that are different than what you can apply to binary signals. So there's a lot of different challenges associated with these different modalities.
So also in terms of communication, you're limited by the amount of data you can send.
Yeah.
So, and also because you're currently using the Bluetooth protocol, you have to batch stuff together. But you have to also do this keeping the latency crazy low. Like crazy low. Anything to say about the latency?
Yeah, this is a passion project of mine. So I want to build the best mouse in the world.
Yeah.
I don't want to build like the, the Chevrolet Spark or whatever of electric cars. I want to build like the Tesla Roadster version of a mouse. And I really do think it's quite possible that within 5 to 10 years that most esports competitions are dominated by people with paralysis. This is like a very real possibility for a number of reasons. One is that they'll have access to the best technology to play video games effectively. The second is they have the time to do so. So those two factors together are particularly potent for esport competitors.
Unless people without paralysis are also allowed to implant Neuralink,
Right.
which is another way to interact with a digital device. And there's something to that. If it's a fundamentally different experience, more efficient experience, even if it's not like some kind of full-on high bandwidth communication, if it's just the ability to move the mouse 10x faster, like the bits per second, if I can achieve a bits per second at 10x what I can do with the mouse, that's a really interesting possibility of what that can do, especially as you get really good at it. With training,
it's definitely the case that you have a higher ceiling performance. Because you don't have to buffer your intention through your arm, through your muscle, you get, just by nature of having a brain implant at all, like 75 millisecond lead time on any action that you're actually trying to take. And there's some nuance to this, like there's evidence that the motor cortex, you can sort of plan out sequences of actions, so you may not get that whole benefit all the time. But for sort of like reaction time style games where you just want to, somebody's over here, snipe them, that kind of thing. You actually do have just an inherent advantage because you don't need to go through muscle. So the question is just how much faster can you make it? And we're already, faster than, what you would do if you're going through muscle from a latency point of view. And we're in the early stages of that. I think we can push it. Sort of our end-to-end latency right now from brain spike to cursor movement is about 22 milliseconds. If you think about the best mice in the world, the best gaming mice, that's about 5 milliseconds-ish of latency, depending on how you measure, depending on how fast your screen refreshes. There's a lot of characteristics that matter there, but yeah. And the rough time for like a neuron in the brain to actually impact your command of your hand is about 75 milliseconds. So if you look at those numbers, you can see that we're already like, competitive and slightly faster than what you'd get by actually moving your hand. And this is something that, if you ask Nolan about it, when he moved the cursor for the first time, we asked him about this. It was something I was super curious about. Like, what does it feel like when you're modulating, a click intention or when you're trying to just move the cursor to the right? He said it moves before he is like actually intending it to, which is kind of a surreal thing and something that, I would love to experience myself one day. What is that like to have the thing just be so immediate, so fluid that it feels like it's happening before you're actually intending it to move?
Yeah, I suppose we've gotten used to that latency, that natural latency that happens. So is currently the bottleneck the communication? So like the Bluetooth communication, what's the actual bottleneck? I mean, there's always going to be a bottleneck, but what's the current bottleneck?
Yeah, a couple things. So kind of hilariously, Bluetooth low energy protocol has some restrictions on how fast you can communicate. So the protocol itself establishes a standard of, the most frequent sort of updates you can send are on the order of 7.5 milliseconds. And as we push latency down to the level of sort of individual spikes impacting control, that level of resolution, that kind of protocol is going to become a limiting factor at some scale. Another sort of important nuance to this is that it's not just the Neuralink itself that's part of this equation. If you start pushing latency sort of below the level of how fast screens refresh, then you have another problem. Like, you need your whole system to be able to be as reactive as the sort of limits of what the technology can offer.
Yes.
Like, you need the screen, like 120 hertz just doesn't, work anymore if you're trying to have something respond at something that's, at the level of 1 millisecond.
That's a really cool challenge. I also like that for a t-shirt, the best mouse in the world. Tell me on the receiving end, so the decoding step. Now we figured out what the spikes are. We got them all together. Now we're sending that over to the app. What's the decoding step look like?
Yeah. So maybe first, what is decoding? I think there's probably a lot of folks listening that just have no clue what it means to decode brain activity.
Actually, even if we zoom out beyond that, what is the app? So there's an implant that's wirelessly communicating with any digital device that has an app installed.
Yep.
So maybe can you tell me at high level what the app is, what the software is outside of the brain?
Yeah. So maybe working backwards from the goal. The goal is to help someone with paralysis, in this case Nolan, be able to navigate his computer independently. And we think the best way to do that is to offer them the same tools that we have to navigate our software, because we don't want to have to rebuild an entire software ecosystem for the brain, at least not yet. Maybe someday you can imagine there's UXs that are built natively for BCI, but in terms of what's useful for people today, I think most people would prefer to be able to just control mouse and keyboard inputs to all the applications that they want to use for their daily jobs, for communicating with their friends, etc. And so the job of the application is really to translate this wireless stream of brain data coming off the implant into control of the computer. And we do that by essentially building a mapping from brain activity to sort of the HID inputs to the actual hardware. So HID is just the protocol for communicating like input device events. So for example, move mouse to this position or press this key down. And so that mapping is fundamentally what the app is responsible for. But there's a lot of nuance of how that mapping works that we spend a lot of time to try to get right. And we're still in the early stages of a long journey to figure out how to do that optimally. So one part of that process is decoding. So decoding is this process of taking the statistical patterns of brain data that's being channeled across this Bluetooth connection to the application and turning it into, for example, a mouse movement. And that decoding step, you can think of it in a couple different parts. So learning problem, there's a training step and there's an inference step. The training step in our case is a very intricate behavioral process where the user has to imagine doing different actions. So for example, they'll be presented a screen with a cursor on it, and they'll be asked to push that cursor to the right. Then imagine pushing that cursor to the left, push it up, push it down. And we can basically build up a pattern, or using any sort of modern ML method, a mapping of given this brain data and that imagined behavior, map one to the other. And then at test time, you take that same pattern matching system, in our case it's a deep neural network, and you run it and you take the live stream of brain.
15 phút mưa nó vẫn nhỏ tí. Nó không giống mưa Sài Gòn cho lắm. Để mình check map xem nào. Thông tin giao thông. Xem ở những chỗ khác nó có mưa không? Quận Nhất không mưa. Đinh Bộ Lĩnh. Trời ảo thật đấy. Mình đang muốn nó mưa to mà, để cho nó mát, mà cuối cùng nó lại không chịu mưa. Ngoài đường cũng không mấy người mặc áo mưa.
Brain data coming off their implant, you decode it by pattern matching to what you saw at calibration time, and you use that for control of the computer. Now, couple like sort of on it, and you take the live stream of brain data coming off their implant, you decode it by pattern matching to what you saw at calibration time, and you use that for control of the computer. Now, a couple like sort of rabbit holes that I think are quite interesting. One of them has to do with how you build that best template matching system, because there's a variety of behavioral challenges and also debugging challenges when you're working with someone who's paralyzed. Because again, fundamentally, you don't observe what they're trying to do. You can't see them attempt to move their hand. And so you have to figure out a way to instruct the user to do something, and validate that they're doing it correctly, such that then you can downstream build with confidence the mapping between the neural spikes and the intended action. And by doing the action correctly, what I really mean is at the level of resolution of what neurons are doing. So if in an ideal world, you could get a signal of behavioral intent that is ground truth accurate at the scale of sort of 1 millisecond resolution, then with high confidence, I could build a mapping from my neural spikes to that behavioral intention. But the challenge is, again, that you don't observe what they're actually doing. And so there's a lot of nuance to how you build user experiences that give you more than just sort of a coarse, on average, correct representation of what the user's intending to do. If you want to build the world's best mouse, you really want it to be as responsive as possible. You want it to be able to do exactly what the user's intending at every sort of step along the way, not just on average be correct when you're trying to move it from left to right. And building a behavioral sort of calibration game or sort of software experience that gives you that level of resolution is what we spend a lot of time working on.
So the calibration process, the interface, has to encourage precision. Meaning, like, whatever it does, it should be super intuitive, that the next thing the human is going to likely do is exactly that intention that you need, and only that intention.
Yeah.
And you don't have any feedback except that may be speaking to you afterwards, what they actually did. You can't, oh yeah.
Right.
So that's fundamentally, that is a really exciting UX challenge, because that's all on the UX. It's not just about being friendly or nice or usable.
Yeah.
It's like
User experience is how it works.
it's how it works.
Yeah.
For the calibration, and calibration, at least at this stage of Neuralink, is like fundamental to the operation of the thing. And not just calibration, but continued calibration, essentially.
Yeah. And maybe
Wow, yeah.
you said something that I think is worth exploring there a little bit. You said it's, primarily a UX challenge. And I think a large component of it is, but there is also a very interesting machine learning challenge here, which is given some, data set, including some on average correct behavior of asking the user to move up or move down, move right, move left. And given a data set of neural spikes, is there a way to infer in some kind of semi-supervised or entirely unsupervised way what that high resolution version of their intention is? And if you think about it, like, there probably is, because there are enough data points in the data set, enough constraints on your model, that there should be a way with the right sort of formulation to let the model figure out itself. For example, at this millisecond, this is exactly how hard they're pushing upwards. And at this millisecond, this is how hard they're trying to push upwards.
It's really important to have very clean labels. Yes. So, like, the problem becomes much harder from the machine learning perspective if the labels are noisy.
That's correct.
And then to get the clean labels, that's a UX challenge.
Correct. Although clean labels, I think maybe it's worth exploring what that exactly means. I think any given labeling strategy will have some number of assumptions it makes about what the user is attempting to do. Those assumptions can be formulated in a loss function, or they can be formulated in terms of heuristics that you might use to just try to estimate or guesstimate what the user is trying to do. And what really matters is how accurate are those assumptions. For example, you might say, hey, user, push upwards and follow the speed of this cursor. And your heuristic might be that they're trying to do it exactly what that cursor is trying to do. Another competing heuristic might be they're actually trying to go slightly faster at the beginning of the movement and slightly slower at the end. And those competing heuristics may or may not be accurate reflections of what the user is trying to do. Another version of the task might be, hey, user, imagine moving this cursor a fixed offset. So rather than follow the cursor, just try to move it exactly 200 pixels to the right. So here's the cursor, here's the target. Okay, cursor disappears. Try to move that now invisible cursor 200 pixels to the right. And the assumption in that case would be that the user can actually modulate correctly that position offset. But that position offset assumption might be a weaker assumption, and therefore potentially you can make it more accurate than these heuristics that are trying to guesstimate at each millisecond what the user is trying to do. So you can imagine different tasks that make different assumptions about the nature of the user intention, and those assumptions being correct is what I would think of as a clean label.
For that step, what are we supposed to be visualizing? There's a cursor, and you want to move that cursor to the right, the left, up and down, or maybe move them by a certain offset. So that's one way. Is that the best way to do calibration? So, for example, an alternative crazy way that probably is playing a role here is a game like WebGrid, where you're just getting a very large amount of data, the person playing a game, where if they are in a state of flow, maybe you can get clean signal as a side effect.
Yep.
Is that not an effective way for initial calibration?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot to unpack there. So The first thing I would draw a distinction between is sort of open loop versus closed loop. So open loop, what I mean by that is the user is sort of going from 0 to 1. They have no model at all, and they're trying to get to the place where they have some level of control at all. In that setup, you really need to have some task that gives the user a hint of what you want them to do, such that you can build this mapping again from brain data to output. Then once they have a model, you could imagine them using that model and actually adapting to it and figuring out the right way to use it themselves, and then retraining on that data to give you sort of a boost in performance. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of challenges associated with both of these techniques, and we can sort of rabbit hole into both of them if you're interested. But the sort of challenge with the open loop task is that the user themselves doesn't get proprioceptive feedback about what they're doing. They don't, necessarily perceive themselves or feel, the mouse under their hand when they're using an open loop, or when they're trying to do an open loop calibration. They're being asked to perform something like, imagine if you sort of had your whole right arm numbed and you stuck it in a box and you couldn't see it. So you had no visual feedback and you had no proprioceptive feedback about what the position or activity of your arm was. And now you're asked, okay, given this thing on the screen that's moving from left to right, match that speed. And you basically can try your best to, invoke whatever that imagined action is in your brain that's moving the cursor from left to right. But in any situation, you're going to be inaccurate and maybe inconsistent in how you do that task. And so that's sort of the fundamental challenge of open loop. The challenge with closed loop is that once the user's given a model and they're able to start moving the mouse on their own, they're going to very naturally adapt to that model. And that co-adaptation between the model learning what they're doing and the user learning how to use the model may not find you the best sort of global minima. It may be that your first model was noisy in some ways, or maybe just had some quirk. Like there's some part of the data distribution it didn't cover super well. And the user now figures out, because they're a brilliant user like Nolan, they figure out the right sequence of imagined motions or the right angle they have to hold their hand at to get it to work. Mm-hmm. And they'll get it to work great. But then the next day they come back to their device and maybe they don't remember exactly all the tricks that they used the previous day. And so there's a complicated sort of feedback cycle here that can emerge and can make it a very, very difficult debugging process.
Okay, there's a lot of really fascinating things there. Actually, just to stay on the closed loop, I've seen situations. This actually happened watching psychology grad students. They use a piece of software when they don't know how to program themselves. They use a piece of software that somebody else wrote, and it has a bunch of bugs. And they figure out and they've been using it for years. Yeah. They figure out ways to work around it. Yeah. Oh, that just happens. Nobody considers maybe we should fix this. They just adapt. And that's a really interesting notion that we're really good at adapting, but you need to that might not be the optimal. Yeah. Okay. So how do you solve that problem? Do you have to restart from scratch every once in a while kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. First and foremost, I would say this is not a solved problem. And for anyone who's listening in academia who works on BCIs, I would also say this is not a problem that's solved by simply scaling channel count. So this is, maybe that can help, and you can get sort of richer covariance structures that you can use to exploit when trying to come up with good labeling strategies. But if you're interested in problems that aren't going to be solved inherently by just scaling channel count, this is one of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you solve it? It's not a solved problem. That's the first thing I want to make sure it gets across. The second thing is any solution that involves closed loop is going to become a very difficult debugging problem. And one of my sort of general heuristics for choosing what problems to tackle is that you want to choose the one that's going to be the easiest to debug. Because if you can do that, even if the ceiling is lower, you're going to be able to move faster because you have a tighter iteration loop debugging the problem. And in the open loop setting, there's not a feedback cycle to debug with the user in the loop. And so there's some reason to think that that should be an easier debugging problem. The other thing that's worth understanding is that even in a closed loop setting, there's no special sauce or magic of how to infer what the user is truly attempting to do. In a closed loop setting, although they're moving the cursor on the screen, they may be attempting something different than what your model is outputting. So what the model is outputting is not a signal that you can use to retrain if you want to be able to improve the model further. You still have this very complicated guesstimation or unsupervised problem of figuring out what is the true user intention underlying that signal. And so the open loop problem has the nice property of being easy to debug, and the second nice property of it has all the same information and content as the closed loop scenario. Another thing I want to mention and call out is that this problem doesn't need to be solved in order to give useful control to people. Even today with the solutions we have now and that academia has built up over decades, the level of control that can be given to a user, today is quite useful. It doesn't need to be solved to get to that level of control. But again, I want to build the world's best mouse. I want to make it, so good that it's not even a question that you want it. And to build the world's best mouse, the superhuman version, you really need to nail that problem. And a couple maybe details of previous studies that we've done internally that I think are very interesting to understand when thinking about how to solve this problem. The first is that even when you have ground truth data of what the user is trying to do, and you can get this with an able-bodied monkey, a monkey that has a Neuralink device implanted and moving a mouse to control a computer, even with that ground truth data set, it turns out that the optimal thing to predict to produce high-performance BCI is not just the direct control of the mouse. You could imagine, building a data set of what's going on in the brain and what is the mouse exactly doing on the table. And it turns out that if you build the mapping from neural spikes to predict exactly what the mouse is doing, that model will perform worse than a model that is trained to predict sort of higher level assumptions about what the user might be trying to do. For example, assuming that the monkey is trying to go in a straight line to the target. Mm-hmm. It turns out that making those assumptions is actually more effective in producing a model than actually predicting the underlying hand movement.
So the intention, not the physical movement or whatever.
Yeah.
There's obviously a really strong correlation between the two, but the intention is a more powerful thing to be chasing.
Right.
Well, that's also super interesting. I mean, the intention itself is fascinating because, yes, with the BCI here in this case, with the digital telepathy, you're acting on the intention, not the action, which is why there's an experience of like feeling like it's happening before you meant for it to happen. That is so cool. And that is why you could achieve like superhuman performance probably in terms of the control of the mouse. So for open loop, just to clarify, so whenever the person is tasked to like move the mouse to the right, you said there's not feedback. So they don't get that satisfaction of like actually getting it to move, right?
So you could imagine giving the user feedback on a screen, but it's difficult because at this point you don't know what they're attempting to do. So what can you show them that would basically give them a signal of I'm doing this correctly or not correctly? So let's take this very specific example. Like maybe your calibration task looks like you're trying to move the cursor a certain position offset. So your instructions to the user are, hey, the cursor's here. Now, when the cursor disappears, imagine moving it 200 pixels from where it was to the right to be over this target. In that kind of scenario, you could imagine coming up with some sort of consistency metric that you could display to the user of, okay, I know what the spike train looks like on average when you do this action to the right. Maybe I can produce some sort of probabilistic estimate of how likely is that to be the action you took given the latest trial or trajectory that you imagined. And that could give the user some sort of feedback of how consistent are they across different trials. You could also imagine that if the user is prompted with that kind of consistency metric, that maybe they just become more behaviorally engaged to begin with because the task is kind of boring when you don't have any feedback at all. And so there may be benefits to the user experience of showing something on a screen, even if it's not accurate, just because it keeps the user motivated to try to increase that number or push it upwards.
So there's a psychology element here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, all of that is UX challenge. How much signal drift is there? Hour to hour, day to day, week to week, month to month? How often do you have to recalibrate because of the signal drift?
Yeah. So this is a problem we've worked on both with NHP, non-human primates, before our clinical trial, and then also with Noland during the clinical trial. Maybe the first thing that's worth stating is what the goal is here. So the goal is really to enable the user to have a plug-and-play experience where, I guess they don't have to plug anything in, but a play experience where they can use the device whenever they want to, however they want to. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're aiming for. And so there can be a set of solutions that get to that state without considering this non-stationarity problem. So maybe the first solution here that's important is that they can recalibrate whenever they want. This is something that that Nolan has the ability to do today. So he can recalibrate the system, at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night without his, caretaker or parents or friends around to help push a button for him. The other important part of the solution is that when you have a good model calibrated, that you can continue using that without needing to recalibrate it. So how often he has to do this recalibration today depends really on his appetite for performance. There are, we observe a sort of a degradation through time of how well any individual model works, but this can be mitigated behaviorally by the user adapting their control strategy. It can also be mitigated through a combination of sort of software features that we provide to the user. For example, we let the user adjust exactly how fast the cursor is moving. We call that the gain, for example, the gain of how fast the cursor reacts to any given input intention. They can also adjust the smoothing, how smooth the output of that cursor intention actually is. They can also adjust the friction, which is how easy is it to stop and hold still. And all these software tools allow the user a great deal of flexibility and troubleshooting mechanisms to be able to solve this problem for themselves.
By the way, all of this is done by looking to the right side of the screen, selecting the mixer, and in the mixer you have
It's like DJ mode. DJ mode for your VCI.
So, I mean, it's a really well done interface. It's really, really well done. And so, yeah, there's that bias that there's a cursor drift that Nolan talked about in a stream. Although he said that you guys were just playing around with it with him and they're constantly improving. So that could have been just a snapshot of that particular moment, a particular day. But he said that there was this cursor drift and this bias that could be removed by him, I guess, looking to the right side of the screen or left side of the screen to kind of adjust the bias.
Yeah.
That's one interface action, I guess, to adjust the bias.
Yeah. So this is actually an idea that comes out of academia. There is some prior work with sort of brain gate clinical trial participants where they pioneered this idea of bias correction. The way we've done it, I think, is it's very productized, very beautiful user experience where the user can essentially flash the cursor over to the side of the screen and it opens up a window where they can actually sort of adjust or tune exactly the bias of the cursor. So bias, maybe for people who aren't familiar, is just sort of what is the default motion of the cursor if you're imagining nothing. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that that's one of the first sort of qualia of the cursor control experience that's impacted by neural non-stationarity.
Qualia of the cursor experience.
I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. Like, I'm not the guy moving.
Very poetic. I love it. The quality of the cursor experience. Yeah, I mean, it sounds poetic, but it is deeply true. There is an experience. When it works well, it is a joyful, a really pleasant experience. And when it doesn't work well, it's a very frustrating experience. That's actually the art of UX. It's like you have the possibility to frustrate people or the possibility to give them joy.
And at the end of the day, it really is truly the case that UX is how the thing works. And so it's not just like what's showing on the screen. It's also, what control surfaces does a decoder provide the user? Like we want them to feel like they're in the F1 car, not like the, some like minivan, right? And that really truly is how we think about it. Nolan himself is an F1 fan. So we refer to ourselves as a pit crew. He really is truly the F1 driver. And there's different, control surfaces that different kinds of cars and airplanes provide the user. And we take a lot of inspiration from that when designing how the cursor should behave. And maybe one nuance of this is, even details like when you move a mouse on a MacBook trackpad, the sort of response curve of how that input that you give the trackpad translates to cursor movement is different than how it works with a mouse. Mm-hmm. When you move it on the trackpad, there's a different response function, a different curve to how much a movement translates to input to the computer than when you do it physically with a mouse. And that's because somebody sat down a long time ago when they're designing the initial input systems to any computer, and they thought through exactly how it feels to use these different systems. And now we're designing sort of the next generation of this input system to a computer, which is entirely done via the brain. And there's no proprioceptive feedback. Again, you don't feel the mouse in your hand. You don't feel the keys under your fingertips. And you want a control surface that still makes it easy and intuitive for the user to understand the state of the system and how to achieve what they want to achieve. And ultimately, the end goal is that UX is it fades into the background. It becomes something that's so natural and intuitive that it's subconscious to the user. And they just should feel like they have basically direct control over the cursor. It just does what they want it to do. They're not thinking about the implementation of how to make it do what they want it to do. It's just doing what they want it to do.
Is there some kind of things along the lines of like Fitt's Law where you should move the mouse in a certain kind of way that maximizes your chance to hit the target? I don't even know what I'm asking, but I'm hoping the intention of my question will land on a profound answer. No. Is there some kind of understanding of the laws of UX when it comes to the context of somebody using their brain to control it? Like that's different than actual with a mouse.
I think we're in the early stages of discovering those laws. So I wouldn't claim to have solved that problem yet. But there's definitely some things we've learned that make it easier for the user to get stuff done. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty straightforward when you verbalize it, but it takes a while to actually get to that point when you're in the process of debugging this stuff in the trenches. one of those things is that any machine learning system you build has some number of errors, and it matters how those errors translate to the downstream user experience. For example, if you're developing a search algorithm in your photos, if you search for your friend Joe and it pulls up a photo of your friend Josephine, maybe that's not a big deal because the cost of an error is not that high. In a different scenario where you're trying to detect insurance fraud or something like this, and you're directly sending someone to court because of some machine learning model output, then the errors make a lot more sense to be careful about. You want to be very thoughtful about how those errors translate to downstream effects. The same is true in BCI. So, for example, if you're building a model that's decoding a velocity output from the brain versus an output where you're trying to modulate the left click, for example, these have sort of different trade-offs of how precise you need to be before it becomes useful to the end user. For velocity, it's okay to be on average correct because the output of the model is integrated through time. So if the user is trying to click at position A and they're currently at position B, they're trying to navigate over time to get between those 2 points. And as long as the output of the model is on average correct, they can sort of steer it through time with the user control loop in the mix. They can get to the point they want to get to. The same is not true of a click. For a click, you're performing it almost instantly, at the scale of neurons firing, and so you want to be very sure that click is correct because a false click can be very destructive to the user. They might accidentally close the tab that they're trying to do something in and lose all their progress. They might accidentally hit some send button on some text that is only like half composed and reads funny after. So there's different sort of cost functions associated with errors in this space, and part of the UX design is understanding how to build a solution that is, when it's wrong, still useful to the end user.
That's so fascinating, that assigning cost to every action when an error occurs. So every action, if an error occurs, has a certain cost. And incorporating that into how you interpret the intention, mapping it to the action, is really important. I didn't quite, until you said it, realize there's a cost to sending the text early. It's a very expensive cost.
It's super annoying. If you accidentally, if your cursor, imagine if your cursor misclicked every once in a while. That's super obnoxious. And the worst part of it is, usually when the user's trying to click, they're also holding still because they're over the target they want to hit and they're getting ready to click. Which means that in the data sets that we build, on average, it's the case that sort of low speeds or desire to hold still is correlated with when the user's attempting to click.
Wow, that is really fascinating.
It's also not the case, people think to click.
Wow.
That sort of low speed click, which means that in the data sets that we build, on average, it's the case that sort of low speeds or desire to hold still is correlated with when the user's attempting to click.
Wow, that is really fascinating.
It's also not the case, people think that, a click is a binary signal. This must be super easy to decode. Well, yes, it is, but the bar is so much higher for it to become a useful thing for the user. And there's ways to solve this. I mean, you can sort of take the compound approach of, let's just give let's take 5 seconds to click. Let's take a huge window of time so we can be very confident about the answer. But again, world's best mouse. The world's best mouse doesn't take a second to click or 500 milliseconds to click. It takes 5 milliseconds to click or less. And so if you're aiming for that kind of high bar, then you really want to solve the underlying problem.
So maybe this is a good place to ask about how to measure performance, this whole bits per second. What can you explain what you mean by that? Maybe a good place to start is to talk about WebGrid as a game, as a good illustration of the measurement of performance.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take one zoom out step there, which is just explaining why we care to measure this at all. So again, our goal is to provide the user the ability to control the computer as well as I can, and hopefully better. And that means that they can do it at the same speed as what I can do. It means that they have access to all the same functionality that I have, including all those little details like command tab, command space, all this stuff. They need to be able to do it with their brain. And with the same level of reliability as what I can do with my muscles. And that's a high bar. And so we intend to measure and quantify every aspect of that to understand how we're progressing towards that goal. There's many ways to measure BPS, by the way. This isn't the only way. But we present the user a grid of targets, and basically we compute a score, which is dependent on how fast and accurately they can select, and then how small are the targets. And the more targets that are on the screen, the smaller they are, the more information you present per click. And so if you think about it from an information theory point of view, you can communicate across different information theoretic channels. And one such channel is a typing interface, you could imagine, that's built out of a grid, just like a software keyboard on the screen. And bits per second is a measure that's computed by taking the log of the number of targets on the screen. You can subtract 1 if you care to model a keyboard, because you have to subtract 1 for the delete key on the keyboard. But log of the number of targets on the screen times the number of correct selections minus incorrect divided by some time window, for example, 60 seconds. And that's sort of the standard way to measure a cursor control task in academia. And all credit in the world goes to this great professor, Dr. Shenoy of Stanford, who came up with that task. And he's also one of my inspirations for being in the field. So all the credit in the world to him for coming up with a standardized metric to facilitate this kind of bragging rights that we have now to say that Nolan is the best in the world at this task with his BCI. It's very important for progress that you have standardized metrics that people can compare across different techniques and approaches. How well does this do? So yeah, big kudos to him and to all the team at Stanford. So for Nolan and for me playing this task, there's also different modes that you can configure this task. So the WebGrid task can be presented as just sort of a left click on the screen, or you could have targets that you just dwell over, or you could have targets that you left right click on. You could have targets that are left, right click, middle click, scrolling, clicking and dragging. You can do all sorts of things within this general framework. But the simplest, purest form is just blue targets show up on the screen, blue means left click. That's the simplest form of the game. And the sort of prior records here in academic work and at Neuralink internally with sort of NHPs have all been matched or beaten by Nolan with his Neuralink device. So sort of prior to Neuralink, the sort of world record for a human using the device is somewhere between 4.2 to 4.6 BPS, depending on exactly what paper you read and how you interpret it. Nolan's current record is 8.5 BPS. And again, the sort of median Neuralinker performance is 10 BPS. So you can think of it roughly as he's 85% the level of control of a median Neuralinker using their cursor to select blue targets on the screen. And I think there's a very interesting journey ahead to get us to that same level of 10 BPS performance. It's not the case that sort of the tricks that got us from 4 to 6 BPS and then 6 to 8 BPS are going to be the ones that get us from 8 to 10. And in my view, the core challenge here is really the labeling problem. It's how do you understand at a very, very fine resolution what the user is attempting to do. And I highly encourage folks in academia to work on this problem.
What's the journey with Nolan on that quest of increasing the BPS on WebGrid? In March, you said that he selected 89,285 targets in WebGrid.
Yep.
So he loves this game. He's really serious about improving his performance in this game. So what is that journey of trying to figure out how to improve that performance? How much can that be done on the decoding side? How much can that be done on the calibration side? How much can that be done on the Nolan side of like figuring out how to convey his intention more cleanly?
This is a great question. So in my view, one of the primary reasons why Nolan's performance is so good is because of Nolan. Nolan is extremely focused and very energetic. He'll play WebGrid sometimes for like 4 hours in the middle of the night, like from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. He'll be playing WebGrid just because he wants to push it to the limits of what he can do. And this is not us like asking him to do that. I want to be clear, like to push it.
Cái gì đây? Independent use structured session week hours. Một tuần mà chơi 70 tiếng cả. Ghê vậy. Một ngày mà chơi đến mười mấy tiếng à? Wow.
To the limits of what he can do. And, this is not us like asking him to do that. I want to be clear. Like we're not saying, hey, you should play WebGrid tonight. We just gave him the game as part of our research, and he is able to play it independently and practice whenever he wants. And he really pushes hard to push the technology to the absolute limit. And he views it as like, his job really to make us be the bottleneck. And boy, has he done that well. And so that's the first thing to acknowledge is that, he is extremely motivated to make this work. I've also had the privilege to meet other, clinical trial participants from BrainGate and other trials, and they very much share the same attitude of like they view this as their life's work to, advance the technology as much as they can. And if that means selecting targets on the screen for 4 hours from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., then so be it. And there's something extremely admirable about that that's worth calling out. Okay, so now how do you sort of get from where he started, which is no cursor control to 8 BPS? So, when he started, there's a huge amount of learning to do on his side and our side to figure out what's the most intuitive control for him. And the most intuitive control for him is you have to find the set intersection of what do we have the signal to decode. So we don't pick up, every single neuron in the motor cortex, which means we don't have representation for every part of the body. So there may be some signals that we have better sort of decode performance on than others. For example, on his left hand, we have a lot of difficulty distinguishing his left ring finger from his left middle finger. But on his right hand, we have a good good control and good modulation detected from the neurons that we're able to record for his pinky and his thumb and his index finger. So you can imagine how these different subspaces of modulated activity intersect with what's the most intuitive for him. And this has evolved over time. So once we gave him the ability to calibrate models on his own, he was able to go and explore various different ways to imagine controlling the cursor. For example, he could imagine controlling the cursor by wiggling his wrist side to side, or by moving his entire arm. I think at one point he did his feet. He tried like a whole bunch of stuff to explore the space of what is the most natural way for him to control the cursor that at the same time is easy for us to decode reliably.
Just to clarify, it's through the body mapping procedure that you're able to figure out which finger he can move?
Yes, that's one way to do it. Maybe one nuance of when he's doing it, he can imagine many more things than we represent in that visual on the screen. Mm-hmm. So we show him sort of abstractly, here's a cursor. You figure out what works the best for you. And we obviously have hints about what will work best from that body mapping procedure of, we know that this particular action we can represent well, but it's really up to him to go and explore and figure out what works the best.
But at which point does he no longer visualize the movement of his body and is just visualizing the movement of the cursor?
Yeah.
How quickly does he go from, how quickly does he get there?
So this happened on a Tuesday. I remember this day very clearly because at some point during the day, it looked like he wasn't doing super well. Like it looked like the model wasn't performing super well and he was like getting distracted. But it wasn't the case. Like what actually happened was he was trying something new where he was just controlling the cursor. So he wasn't imagining moving his hand anymore. He was just imagining, I don't know what it is, some like abstract intention to move the cursor on the screen. And I cannot tell you what the difference between those two things are. I really, truly cannot. He's tried to explain it to me before. I cannot, give a first-person account of what that's like. But the expletives that he uttered in that moment were, enough to suggest that it was a very qualitatively different experience for him to just have direct neural control over a cursor.
I wonder if there's a way through UX to encourage a human being to discover that. Because he discovered it, like you said to me, that he's a pioneer. So he discovered that on his own through all of this, the process of trying to move the cursor with different kinds of intentions. But that is clearly a really powerful thing to arrive at, which is to let go of trying to control the fingers and the hand and control the actual digital device with your mind.
That's right. UX is how it works. And the ideal UX is one that the user doesn't have to think about what they need to do in order to get it done. It just does it.
That is so fascinating. But I wonder on the biological side, how long it takes for the brain to adapt.
Yeah.
So is it just simply learning like high level software, or is there like a neuroplasticity component where like the brain is adjusting slowly?
Yeah, the truth is I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to see with sort of the second participant that we implant what the journey is like for them, because we'll have learned a lot more. Potentially we can help them understand and explore that direction more quickly. This is something I didn't, this wasn't me prompting Nolan to go try this. He was just exploring how to use his device and figured it out himself. But now that we know that that's a possibility, that maybe there's a way to, for example, hint the user, don't try super hard during calibration. Just do something that feels natural, or just directly control the cursor. Don't imagine explicit action. And from there, we should be able to hopefully understand how this is for somebody who has not experienced that before. Maybe that's the default mode of operation for them. You don't have to go through this intermediate phase of explicit motions.
Or maybe if that naturally happens for people, you can just occasionally encourage them to allow themselves to move the cursor.
Right.
Actually, sometimes just like with a 4-minute mile, just the knowledge that that's possible.
Yes. Pushes you to do it.
Enables you to do it. And then it becomes trivial. And then it also makes you wonder, this is the cool thing about humans. Once there's a lot more human participants, they will discover things that are possible.
Yes. And share their experiences.
Yeah, and share it. Other. And that because of them sharing it, they'll be able to do it. All of a sudden, that's unlocked for everybody.
Yeah.
Because just the knowledge sometimes is the thing that enables it to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and just to comment on that too, like we've probably tried like 1,000 different ways to do various aspects of decoding. And now we know like what the right subspace is to continue exploring further. Again, thanks to Nolan and the many hours he's put into this. And so even just that help constrain sort of the beam search of different approaches that we could explore really helps accelerate for the next person, the set of things that we'll get to try on day one, how fast we hope to get them to useful control, how fast we can enable them to use it independently and to get value out of the system. So yeah, massive hats off to Nolan and all the participants that came before him to make this technology a reality.
So how often are the updates to the decoder? Because Nolan mentioned like, okay, there's a new update that we're working on, and that in the stream he said he plays the snake game because it's like super hard. It's a good way for him to test like how good the update is. So, and he says like sometimes the update is a step backwards. It's like it's a constant like iteration. So how often, like what does the update entail? Is it mostly on the decoder side?
Yeah, a couple comments. So one is, it's probably worth drawing a distinction between sort of research sessions where we're actively trying different things to understand like what the best approach is, versus sort of independent use where we wanted to have ability to just go use the device how anybody would want to use their MacBook. And so what he's referring to is, I think, usually in the context of a research session where we're trying many different approaches to, even unsupervised approaches like we talked about earlier to try to come up with better ways to estimate his true intention and more accurately decode it. And in those scenarios, I mean, we try in any given session, he'll sometimes work for like 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so that can be, hundreds of different models that we would try in that day, like a lot of different things. Now, it's also worth noting that we update the application he uses quite frequently. I think, sometimes up to like 4 or 5 times a day, we'll update his application with different features or bug fixes or feedback that he's given us. So he's a very articulate person who is part of the solution. He's not a complaining person. He says, hey, here's this thing that I've discovered is not optimal in my flow. Here's some ideas how to fix it. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let's figure out how to solve it. And it often happens that those things are addressed within a couple hours of him giving us his feedback. That's the kind of iteration cycle we'll have. And so sometimes at the beginning of the session he'll give us feedback, and at the end of the session he's giving us feedback on the next iteration of that process or that setup.
That's fascinating because one of the things you mentioned that there was 271 pages of notes taken from the BCI sessions, and this was just in March. So one of the amazing things about human beings that they can provide, especially ones who are smart and excited and all like positive and good vibes like Nolan, that they can provide feedback, continuous feedback.
Yeah. It also requires, just to brag on the team a little bit, I work with a lot of exceptional people, and it requires the team being absolutely laser focused on the user and what will be the best for them. And it requires like a level of commitment of, okay, this is what the user feedback was. I have all these meetings. We're going to skip that today and we're going to do this. Mm-hmm. That level of focus commitment is, I would say, underappreciated in the world. And also, you obviously have to have the talent to be able to execute on these things effectively. And we have that in loads.
Yeah, and this is such a interesting space of UX design because there's so many unknowns here. And I can tell UX is difficult because of how many people do it poorly. It's just not a trivial thing.
Yeah. It's also, UX is not something that you can always solve by just constant iterating on different things. Like sometimes you really need to step back and think globally, am I even in like the right sort of minima to be chasing down for a solution? Like there's a lot of problems in which sort of fast iteration cycle is the predictor of how successful you will be. As a good example, like in an RL simulation, for example, the more frequently you get reward, the faster you can progress. It's just an easier learning problem the more frequently you get feedback. But UX is not that way.
Mình sẽ xem đến hết cái này thôi. Mình thấy bắt đầu hơi bị mất tập trung rồi, nên là không muốn giảm chất lượng cái buổi lại chất lượng mình consume kiến thức.
I mean, users are actually quite often wrong about.
Nhưng mà đang không hiểu tại sao cái đoạn này mà nó lại most replayed.
What the right solution is, and it requires a deep understanding of the technical system and what's possible, combined with what the problem is you're trying to solve. Not just how the user expressed it, but what the true underlying problem is to actually get to the right place.
Yeah, that's the old like stories of Steve Jobs, like rolling in there, like, yeah, the user is a useful signal, but it's not a perfect signal. And sometimes you have to remove the floppy disk drive or whatever I forgot all the crazy stories of Steve Jobs, like making wild design decisions. Mm-hmm. But some of it is aesthetic, that some of it is about the love you put into the design, which is very much a Steve Jobs, Johnny Ive type thing. But when you have a human being using their brain to interact with it, it also is deeply about function. It's not just aesthetic.
Yep.
And that you have to empathize with a human being before you while not always listening to them directly. Like you have to deeply empathize. It's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. And at the same time, iterate, right? But not iterate in small ways. Sometimes a complete, like rebuilding the design. He said that, Nolan said in the early days, the UX sucked,
Yeah.
but you improved quickly.
Yeah.
What was that journey like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give one concrete example. So he really wanted to be able to read manga. This is something that
Yeah.
it sounds like a simple thing, but it's actually a really big deal for him. And he couldn't do it with this mouse stick. It wasn't accessible. You can't scroll with the mouse stick on his iPad and on the website that he wanted to be able to use to read the newest manga. And so
Might be a good quick pause to say the mouth stick is the thing he's using, holding a stick in his mouth to scroll on a tablet.
right, yeah, it's basically, you can imagine it's a stylus that you hold between your teeth.
Yeah.
It's basically a very long stylus.
And it's exhausting, it hurts, and it's inefficient.
Yeah, and maybe it's also worth calling out there are other alternative assistive technologies, but the particular situation Nolan's in, and this is not uncommon, and I think it's also not well understood by folks, is that he's relatively spastic, so he'll have muscle spasms from time to time, and so any assistive technology that requires him to be positioned directly in front of a camera, for example, an eye tracker, or anything that requires him to put something in his mouth, just is a no-go, because he'll either be shifted out of frame when he has a spasm, or if he has something in his mouth, it'll stab him in the face, if he spasms too hard. So these kind of considerations are important when thinking about what advantages a PCI has in someone's life. If it fits ergonomically into your life in a way that you can use it independently and your caretaker's not there, wherever you want to, either in the bed or in the chair, depending on your comfort level and your desire to have pressure sores, all these factors matter a lot in how good the solution is in that user's life. So one of these very fun examples is scroll. So again, manga is something he wanted to be able to read, and there's many ways to do scroll with the BCI. You can imagine like different gestures, for example, the user could do that would move the page. But scroll is a very fascinating control surface because it's a huge thing on the screen in front of you. Mm-hmm. So any sort of jitter in the model output, any sort of error in the model output causes like an earthquake on the screen. Like you really don't want to have your manga page that you're trying to read be shifted up and down a few pixels just because your scroll decoder is not completely accurate. And so this was an example where we had to figure out how to formulate the problem in a way that the errors of the system, whenever they do occur, and we'll do our best to minimize them, but whenever those errors do occur, that it doesn't interrupt the qualia, again, of the experience that the user is having. It doesn't interrupt their flow of reading their book. And so what we ended up building is this really brilliant feature. This is a teammate named Bruce who worked on this really brilliant work called Quick Scroll. And Quick Scroll basically looks at the screen and it identifies where on the screen are scroll bars. And it does this by deeply integrating with macOS to understand where are the scroll bars actively present on the screen using the sort of accessibility tree that's available to macOS apps. And we identified where those scroll bars are and we provided a BCI scroll bar. And the BCI scroll bar looks similar to a normal scroll bar, but it behaves very differently in that once you sort of move over to it, your cursor sort of morphs onto it. It sort of attaches or latches onto it. And then once you push up or down in the same way that you'd use a push to control, the normal cursor, it actually moves the screen for you. So it's basically like remapping the velocity to a scroll action. And the reason that feels so natural and intuitive is that when you move over to attach to it, it feels like magnetic, so you're like sort of stuck onto it. And then it's one continuous action. You don't have to like switch your imagined movement. You sort of snap onto it and then you're good to go. You just immediately can start pulling the page down or pushing it up. And even once you get that right, there's so many little nuances of how the scroll behavior works to make it natural and intuitive. So one example is momentum. Like when you scroll a page with your fingers on the screen, you actually have some like flow. Like it doesn't just stop right when you lift your finger up. The same is true with BCI scroll. So we had to spend some time to figure out what are the right nuances when you don't feel the screen under your fingertip anymore. What is the right sort of dynamic or what's the right amount of page give, if you will, when you push it to make it flow the right amount for the user to have a natural experience reading their book. And there's I could tell you like there's so many little minutiae of how exactly that scroll works that we spent probably like a month getting right to make that feel extremely natural and easy for the user to navigate.
I mean, even the scroll on a smartphone with your finger feels extremely natural and pleasant. And it probably takes an extremely long time to get that right. And actually the same kind of visionary UX design that we're talking about. Don't always listen to the users, but also listen to them and also have like visionary big, like throw everything out, think from first principles, but also not. Yeah. By the way, it just makes me think that scroll bars on the desktop probably have stagnated and never taken that, like, because the snap, same as it's like snap to grid, snap to scroll bar action you're talking about is something that could potentially be extremely useful in the desktop setting.
Yeah.
Even just for users to just improve the experience, because the current scroll bar experience on the desktop is horrible.
Yeah.
It's hard to find, hard to control. There's not a momentum. And the intention should be clear. When I start moving towards the scroll bar, there should be a snapping to the scroll bar action. But of course, maybe I'm okay paying that cost, but there's hundreds of millions of people paying that cost nonstop. But anyway, but in this case, this is necessary because there's an extra cost paid by Nolan for the jitteriness. So you have to switch between the scrolling and the reading. There has to be a phase shift between the two. Like when you're scrolling, you're scrolling.
Right. So that is one drawback of the current approach. Maybe one other just sort of case study here. So again, UX is how it works, and we think about that holistically from like even the feature detection level of what we detect in the brain to how we design the decoder, what we choose to decode, to then how it works once it's being used by the user. So another good example in that sort of how it works once they're actually using the decoder, the output that's displayed on the screen is not just what the decoder says. It's also a function of what's going on the screen. So we can understand, for example, that when you're trying to close a tab, that very small, stupid little X that's extremely tiny, which is hard to get precisely hit if you're dealing with sort of a noisy output of the decoder, we can understand that that is a small little X you might be trying to hit and actually make it a bigger target for you. Similar to how when you're typing on your phone, if you're used to like the iOS keyboard, for example, it actually adapts the target size of individual keys based on an underlying language model. So it'll actually understand if I'm typing, hey, I'm going to see L, it'll make the E key bigger because it knows Lex is the person I'm going to go see. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of predictiveness can make the experience much more smooth, even without improvements to the underlying decoder or feature detection part of the stack. So we do that with a feature called magnetic targets. We actually index the screen and we understand, okay, these are the places that are very small targets that might be difficult to hit. Here's the kind of cursor dynamics around that location that might be indicative of the user trying to select it. Let's make it easier. Let's blow up the size of it in a way that makes it easier for the user to sort of snap onto that target. So all these little details, they matter a lot in helping the user be independent in their day-to-day living.
So how much of the work on the decoder is generalizable?
Hôm nay là đến đây thôi. Ngày mai mình sẽ xem nốt. Còn khoảng 2 tiếng 20 phút nữa. Yep. Còn khoảng 20 phút là xem bạn này. Và sau đấy sẽ là cái phần cái người mà được nhận. Cái người mà được nhận gọi là gì? Được nhận bệnh nhân đầu tiên của cái Neuralink này. Và mình thấy một sự tinh tế này. Và cả một cái podcast gồm Elon, rồi CEO của Neuralink, rồi Head of cái gì phẫu thuật rồi đến người thứ tư là cái bạn lead, đều ở trong cái phòng của Lex đây. Nhưng mà người thứ tư là người mà bị liệt tứ chi, cho nên là Lex đến nhà của anh ta để phỏng vấn làm podcast. Một sự tinh tế không hề nhẹ nữa nha. Bye bye, hẹn gặp lại vào ngày mai mình sẽ đi chạy về, tắm rửa sạch sẽ rồi mình sẽ ngồi livestream. Bye bye.